Hello. As I said in the introduction, I wanted to take some time to actually, in as close as I ever come to a formal lecture, look at some of the major transformations and changes in teaching that are happening at the moment and give you some of the big words that are important in a comparison between the old sort of world style of academic teaching and what distinguished it and what's different in the new. Old style university teaching, you did a PhD, you turned your PhD into a monograph, big heavy book, you pursued an academic career. As part of that career, particularly throughout the 20th century, as enrollments in university grew, you taught people by standing in front of them and talking at them. And Ken Robinson has pointed out that there were many faults in that type of system. It also applied at second level. It put the teacher in front as the person responsible for transferring knowledge to the students. It was very industrial. It was mass production of people. It was behaviorist rather than constructivist, by which we mean it required people to conform to certain behaviors and certain practices. It measured outcomes. So at the end of the course, if you could tick the box, then you had acquired the qualification. You could have acquired the qualification by photocopying somebody else's notes and correctly picking what was coming up on the exam, but that was okay. You got the piece of paper. And it was driven by content, by the transmission of bodies of knowledge from the people who possessed it to the people who needed it. And in some disciplines, that's still valid. If I'm having surgery, I want the cardiac surgeon to know where all the bits go. So there's places where content is important. But in an increasingly complex world, it's not enough. Skills training is not necessarily the same as education. And the other thing about education is, of course, now that we are increasingly preparing people for what are called alternative academic careers, or alternatives to academic careers, ALT-AC, where people who go through university will be going into libraries, galleries, museums. They will be going into work, and in work they will be dealing with knowledge and learning. So they will have to take knowledge and package it and provide it in a way that people can learn stuff that they need to know. So in almost every career, you need to teach, or at least you need to create learning opportunities. So we need to think about this whole teaching and learning business in a much broader way, not just as creating online courses for university-style audiences, but creating learning opportunities for everybody. So regardless of what you're doing now and what you're going to be doing in 12 to 18 months' time or 5 years down the road, you will need in some way, shape, or form, whether it's on a one-to-one basis or for a large group, to create ways in which people can learn what you know so they can do their job better. And a lot of these theories apply across those, not just to university teaching. So there's a huge raft of contemporary learning teaching, and there's an enormous map that's been put together of the key thinkers and their ideas. And I'll give you a link to it later, but I don't want you getting lost in it just yet. But I'm going to pick out some of the issues. One is learning outcomes. You will become familiar with learning outcomes. The idea of learning outcomes is to define what the outcome of the course should be. So they are very much driven by contents and outcomes. But the best example that I have is if you were to teach a course on how to ride a bicycle, and your learning outcome was students will be able to ride a bicycle, then an appropriate assessment would be you'd make them ride a bicycle, not have them write an essay about riding a bicycle. The thing about learning outcomes is that they're based on a very famous thing called Bloom's taxonomy, which identifies different levels of learning, from simply capturing knowledge up to critical thinking and creativity. They're also mandated by the Bologna Declaration, which is a key document underpinning all of European higher education. So basically almost every country in Europe, either in their education laws or in their practices, have established that if you have a course, it will have learning outcomes. Boom. One of the problems with them is, of course, that they relate to Bloom's taxonomy of knowledge. A great many of the skills that we teach and deal with in the digital world actually deal with the much less well-known affective taxonomy, which deals with things like skills in collaboration and interaction. So we'll look more at learning outcomes and at the pros and the cons and how you write them. Another formula or formulation that's very popular in online learning is TPAC, which is simply a map that identifies the things you need to know about. You need to know about content knowledge, the blue one in the bottom corner, which everybody has some content knowledge about something. But the other skills that you don't have for creating learning experiences are technological knowledge, how to use the technology, which we will develop throughout the whole master's program, and pedagogical knowledge, knowledge of how learning works, which is a huge field, but we're going to pick out some of the important ones. So we're not going to get too bogged down in the detail of this, but I put it up here to show you roughly, you've all got a bit of this, some of you have quite a lot of it. You'll be developing more of it as you do your research, and these are the areas that we're going to be filling in, coloring in the map. This is a very famous and popular framework for creating online learning by Diane Laurillard from the UK. And it's quite detailed. She's written several books on it. She lectures widely on it. It's been very popular as a way of thinking about creating online learning. And the key thing really is the title, that it is a conversational framework. So she envisaged in this, there would not simply be a case of the teacher creating content and dumping it out there, but that there is actually a process whereby you observe what the learner is doing and what they're learning, and then you readjust and change and redevelop your content, bearing in mind how the learner is progressing. So it is a package, theoretically, which is very popular, particularly in the UK. It is difficult, I think, to implement all the 12 steps in it. But I think the idea of it as a conversation is useful, and it's a useful way to think of what we're doing as more than just a one-way traffic, and that's why it's very important. Also out of the UK is Gilly Salmon's idea of e-tivities, electronic activities, and what's particularly important is the way in which, and we will certainly look at this in more detail later, the way in which she structures the process. So if you actually look at the image, you'll see that initially there's the area of access and motivation where you get people together and build a group, building an online collaborative community. And then when you've built the community, then you get to information interchange and you can actually start doing some real work, and you can start to contribute to knowledge and then build something genuine at the end. So she very carefully mapped out the steps and the things that you have to do. It's one of the reasons why almost all of my online courses begin with a forum where people introduce themselves and where their interests are in relation to the course, because that's the first step. So we'll look at some of the things she's written and some of the stuff that she's put on the web. It's very simple, but very important stuff. We'll look a little at badging, which is a key topic. It's important. It's a means of breaking qualifications down into smaller steps. It requires a bit of work to get it right, but we will introduce the idea and we'll look at some of the readings and some of the places that it's been done in practice. But I don't know that we will be able to implement it in full detail, but it is possible in designing a learning experience as part of your assessments for this. You will find ways to use badging as a means to measure people's progress. And it links to the topic of gamification in society in general. Flipped classroom is how I work. Flipped classroom is the transformation from what they call the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. It is based on the understanding now that students do not absorb content dump, that the 1 hour incessantly talking to people lecture is not an effective way of preparing people for learning. And it is not the best way of getting information or skills from the teacher to the learners. So it transfers agency from the teacher to the learner. It means that the learner has to take more responsibility for their learning. It's a little scary for teachers because it means that you have to step back a little bit and surrender some control over the process. but you get a better result in the end. So the most common means are use of video or readings to deliver content outside class. Look at this video, read these things. Shorter videos usually than an hour. And then you use the class time for discussion, for activities, for inquiry-based learning. In schools, it's how they do it in schools is that the stuff the teacher would tell the children in schools is still delivered by video, and the homework is done in class. The practical work is done in class. In university, it means that the old-fashioned 1-hour lecture is replaced by shorter online lectures, use of well-chosen readings, use of discussion prompts, and then student discussion activity. So it provides for a blended model. It is at the heart of what they call blended learning, where you're using maybe some face-to-face and some online materials and tasks in a blended way, using whichever is most appropriate to deliver the activities. So flipped classroom, the power goes to the students, the responsibility goes to the students. Personal learning environment is something that's important. What is your personal learning environment? Mine obviously involves my iPad, it involves my laptop, it also involves people outside of in UCC and outside of UCC with whom I interact. It involves digital content that I get, it involves people I follow on Twitter, it involves a whole range of things. And how do you build that? How do you cultivate and build a network of tools that you can use effectively, and people and sources of content, websites, blogs, things where useful stuff come up, into a network that will keep you in touch with what's happening in your field and support you in your ongoing learning. And of course there's the wonderful t-shirt that says PLE is people, because it's not just about the technology. The most important part is the people that you use the technology to interact with. Research-based learning is another part of the big shift. Traditionally, teaching was research-led rather than research-based, right? Because in research-led teaching, particularly at universities, what happened was that the academics who were doing the research would tell the students about the research, and demonstrate and bring in readings and journal articles, and in fields that move very fast, it would be the fast-moving recent journal articles would be brought in, and academics would survey what had happened, how the particular discipline had unfolded, but it was very much the expert telling the people, the students, about what was happening. And good teaching was always based on research. It was always based on research the academic did, but it tended to be very much a telling of a story. And what's happening is, particularly in the UK, as the result of work like people like Mick Healy, he's the key figure in the UK, but there are others, there's a move to research-based teaching, where instead of just telling the students about research, students are involved in doing research. So, for instance, in the sort of work that we can do with digitization of documents, previously, when I was an undergrad, you couldn't handle primary documents. Material, when I was doing my research on United Nations peacekeeping, the documents on all the United Nations documents were in the UN archive in New York. And you had to go, and they were in boxes, in paper, and you had to read them. Now, most of those documents are digitally available online. So if I want all the United Nations Secretary General reports on the United Nations force in Lebanon, I can get them right here, right now, from my laptop. That means that instead of telling you what's in them, I can give an entire class these documents, and I can say, read the document, see what you get out of it, do research on it, and you can actually understand the process whereby you get from a pile of documents to some answers. You get to walk the walk rather than just being told about it. I put this one up because it's this idea that for personal knowledge management, this process of seeking out information, making sense of it, and sharing it back again. This is an important set of skills. And there's a number of different variations there and things that are important in it in terms of how you acquire knowledge, how you filter it out, what rules you develop to filter it out, how you take care of it, how you curate your collection of knowledge, tidying your bookshelf, which consists of books and stuff on the laptop and email and feeds. How do you manage this and make sense out of it? And then how do you put it in some kind of order, add value to it, and share it back out with the community? This whole process of seeking out stuff, making sense, adding value, finding some interpretation, and then give it back to the community. It's what a lot of digital humanities research is about, but it's also increasingly something that we can do in the classroom. Instead of just telling people, you can actually get people to do stuff where they're doing this hands-on. Teaching for understanding is interesting as a framework. It comes out of Harvard's Project Zero, and the reason teaching for understanding as a framework is interesting is that instead of being focused on the outcome, the big test at the end, teaching for understanding actually looks at this idea of performances of understanding. And of course, when you're designing using teaching for understanding, what you do is you try to create several different stages where the students can demonstrate, the learners can demonstrate their understanding, initially of simple topics, then of more complicated topics, and then at the end, a performance of mastery. So there are understanding goals and there are through lines, ideas that run through the different levels of understanding, and the focus therefore is on ongoing assessment rather than the big bang at the end. And a key thing that strings it together is this idea of generative topics, topics that create more questions as you go along, topics that spin off interesting new questions which allow people to explore rather than simply going down a single straight line to the end. So it's a much more useful framework, particularly this idea of performance for understanding. It requires you to think, okay, 3 weeks into this process, what do I want my students to be able to do? And how does that build into what I want them to be able to do 6 or 7 weeks down the road? And what do I want them to be able to do at the end? And for that reason, it's an interesting way of framing your approach to designing something. Communities of inquiry is important, and I think we'll come to this rather soon, because the work on communities of inquiry is about building learning communities. It's very important in terms of it looks at the elements of social presence, us being a community, cognitive presence, thinking about things, and also what is the role of the teacher? What is the teaching presence? Selecting content. I've selected content, it's in Blackboard. But as I go through the thing, I also have a different type of teaching presence where I observe your reading of the content and I react to it and respond and guide the process. So it's about how you build this community. But the really interesting part of it, in terms of discussion, is that within it there is this method of analyzing online discussions. Discussion, since the time of Socrates, is what education is all about. It is about discussion and questioning and debate to and fro. And Garrison and Anderson have identified what they see as 4 phases in a discussion. The trigger, the exploration, where you toss ideas around and bring new stuff in and ask new questions. The integration phase, when you begin to draw things together. And then the resolution, which could be the answer, or it could be the next question. My experience is that these phases of a discussion take more than a week to get through for any given topic, which is why topics run over and underlap the next one. But it's a very important framework, along with Caroline Gunwardena's work, which she has 5 phases, they have 4. But we're going to look at those 2 very definitely, because given that so much of online learning requires some understanding of how discussion works, these are very important. So that's going to be some of our first heavy lifting in the course. There we go. Threshold concepts are important. I've got Janet Donnell's definition from 2001 there, a unit of thought or an eminence of knowledge that allows us to organize experience. Most of the work's being done by two people, Ray Land and Jan Mayer. And there's an annual conference about threshold concepts. The idea is that a threshold concept transforms your understanding in a discipline. So it is something that once you grasp it, it changes how you understand the nature of knowledge as it is constructed in that disciplinary field. And what they do at the Threshold Concepts Conference is they look at papers and research from different fields where you identify troublesome concepts, difficult points for students to get over, which once they get over them in various disciplines, economics, geography, physics, engineering, maths, whatever, it's like, boom, you get it. Hard to design for, but very important to be aware of. What are the threshold concepts? What are the big ideas that are difficult to grasp? And once you get them, it's like you've moved to a different understanding of what's going on. And you can all think back, and when we discuss it, we'll see what you can think about, where you remember where something like that happened, where a little light went on, and then afterwards you never looked at a particular issue in quite the same way again, because you'd crossed a threshold. It was a transformation. Transformative learning comes from the field of adult learning. All the work on it was done by a man called Jack Nazaryov. And he found that adult learners came to learning because they were motivated, they had a problem they wanted to solve, and at the end of the program, if it had been successful, their understanding and their skills would have been transformed, and they would have learned how to solve that problem. And it's very difficult to design for. But it's certainly something that more attention is being paid to in terms of how you can at least create the conditions which will support and create opportunities for people to have a transformative experience during their learning process. My own experience is that it takes a while. In teaching conventional history, I found that there is a point in third year at which students, a great many of them, not all of them, begin to see things differently, cross a threshold, grasp the nature of the discipline in a different way, and that certainly, means that they leave with a degree which, in the course of which they have changed their understanding of how the world works. But we'll look a little bit about the writing and the theory about it, and we'll hold it up there as something that we would be aware of, but we cannot guarantee that we will be able to create that. Pedagogy, andragogy, and hotology is important, and I have a good reading on this, and it's really fairly simple. But it's this progression. Pedagogy is where you teach people. But andragogy and hotagogy are the lesser-known Greek words to deal with self-regulated learning and self-directed learning. And of course, it's very, very important, particularly for adult learners and lifelong learners, that you actually learn how to regulate your own learning, manage your own time, take responsibility for it, and also that you think about pursuing self-directed learning, where you have a problem that you need to learn about, and there is no one who can teach you, or there is no formal course that exactly meets the needs of what you need to learn about. So you have to work out, how do I create a learning pathway for myself through the material? So one of the things that we have in the university, classic transformation, we get people in at 18 who have been in an environment where teaching is something that's done to them. And we have to get them into a situation where they can take responsibility for regulating their own learning, and ideally by the time they get out, they have some ability to direct their own learning in the discipline and figure out where there's a problem, what they need to learn, and find the solutions. So it's like a ladder. And we'll look at the differences, and we'll read some articles on it, because it's important that you be aware of where your learners are and how you're trying to equip them to be more self-reliant. I brought this in because it's from business-based knowledge management. It's the SECI module, This is the Nonaka and Takuchi, and it's almost the foundation of knowledge management in business, which theoretically is a completely different thing to teaching and learning, but in practice it's kind of the same when you get into the lifelong learning phase, because in business, the knowledge management problem is that people in a business know a lot of stuff about how the business works. And the problem with managing that knowledge and moving it along is that you need to share it explicitly. So their model talks about creating a social environment in which people are comfortable sharing the knowledge. They take knowledge that they instinctively know and they make it explicit. Write down how you do these things so that other people can then learn how to do it, and we're not just depending on the one guy in the business who knows how to reboot servers. What's the procedure? Write down the procedure. And you see this in many small businesses where the person who created the business is the one who internally knows himself or herself all about how it works, and then if something happens to them, everything stops. Right? And there is a point at which you have to write down the stuff, and then you combine it together. And in many businesses, a huge amount of effort goes into taking, if they're going into a new market or there's a change in the market, what do we know? How can we get it out and combine it in a way to create new solutions to a new problem that's emerged? And then how do we make that part of the corporate culture again? Having identified a problem, gathered the knowledge and brought it out into the air of what we need to do, combined it to find a solution, and then make it part of the operational goals. In a very simple way, call centers do this. A new issue starts coming up on Monday morning, everybody starts calling in with a new problem. The people running the call center sit down and they say, okay, we've got 15 calls about this. What's the answer to this problem? Let's write the one-line answer. Let's get it in the manual. Let's give it to everyone on the phones so that tomorrow they know how to deal with it. That's a very small example of knowledge management in business. And it seems to me that as we go along, learning and business knowledge management are going to become closer and closer together. Critical pedagogy is about criticizing the world as it is. It's about taking a situation and saying, okay, how do we transform and change this? It's about asking questions about the social construction of education. Maker education, which has come up in digital humanities, is the idea that the educator is a lead learner and is a maker of things. So in digital humanities, there's an argument that you should be, if you're a digital humanist, you should be creating databases, building websites, and that your teaching should be centered around building things, in the sense of building digital things. And that fits in with flipped classroom and inquiry-based learning and research-based learning. It makes sense that these all go together. But you'll certainly come across the idea of making in digital humanities pedagogy quite a lot. So meaningful education now is student-centered. It's about the student, not the teacher. It's research-based. It's based on practical activity and inquiry. It's active. It is not a passive thing. It is not pouring water into a bucket. It is lighting a fire. It crosses thresholds of knowledge, and it is therefore transformative. It changes the way, ideally, that you see the world. It generates new ideas. It has to foster self-regulated and self-directed learning. It needs to be critical of whatever the current problem is, whether it's in sort of social problems, economic, political, engineering. We're doing this wrong. We need to build a better motor car, whatever. And all of these things are important over and above simply the content and the knowledge. Because what we are doing in creating learning experiences is we're trying to prepare people for a world which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that comes down to an acronym, VUCA, and you can Google it. It's got widespread use in the military and in parts of business where people are saying, this is the way the world is going to be. It's going to be these things. It's going to change quickly. We need to prepare people for this sort of world. Therefore, education that's meaningful and useful has to keep its eye on the ball of these problems going forward, to prepare people for the day when you're not there and they need to have the skills to solve problems that you hadn't anticipated. So that's a very different thing to sit down, shut up, and take notes and reproduce them in the exam at the end. And not all of those are easy to achieve. But I wanted to put them out there as things, some of which we'll look at in detail, some of which we won't have time to get to, but as part of a big picture, the ball that we kind of need to keep our eye on and try and keep in play and keep moving along as we go through, and keep in sight while we deal with the mechanics of, okay, what do I want to teach people? How do I assess it, grade it, create activities that convey it, all that sort of stuff. So hopefully that will give you some things to think about, and we will go back to some of these over the coming weeks in more detail.